Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Press, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.net. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. I'm anxious to continue our reading now and discussion of the book Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson. Remember, last Friday before the weekend, we concluded by learning that during the Council of Trent, a special podium or lectern was erected for the Jesuit general at the time, Lainez, and placed in a conspicuous place in the council chamber so that whatever Lainez said could be distinctly heard by the rest of the council. Now, this was extraordinary treatment for a brand new institution called the Jesuit Order, and it provoked and humiliated most of the other monastic orders of the Roman Catholic Church to see this type of reaction by the council in receiving the Jesuit order in such a pronounced and exaggerated manner. Clearly, the council intended for the Jesuit order to have a lot of say in that council. And as other historians, particularly Eric John Phelps, points out, it was the Jesuit order that initiated this General Council of the Roman Catholic Church in the first place, the Council of Trent. And it was brought about to deal with reform within the Roman Catholic Church, first of all, to firmly reestablish the old Roman religion, to make it clear to the Catholic world that nothing was going to change within the Roman Catholic Church, but where reforms were possible that would not detract from the power of the popes and the councils, where reform was advantageous to strengthen their power, that's where the reform would come. And then to assess, once it was clearly established that Roman Catholicism was not going to change, was not going to reform, as in the context of the Protestant reformers, and that reform that they desired of the Roman Catholic Church, they set about then in general discussion about the evils of the time that caused the downfall and the weakening of the papacy. And it was that downfall was attributed to the Protestant Reformation. And the Jesuit order, through Lainez, set out to counter the Protestant Reformation. This is what we refer to as the Counter-Reformation. If this subject is new to my listeners, I suggest that you find an authoritative source and study the Counter-Reformation, the Jesuit-led Counter-Reformation. Now, you can consider the Council of Trent to be the foundation of the Counter-Reformation, the Jesuit-led Counter-Reformation. The Roman Catholic Church essentially declared war upon Protestantism. The Council of Trent was a declaration of war against Protestantism. And leading that war is the militia for the Pope, the Jesuit order. Now, back to the setting here at the Council of Trent and the podium set up for Lainez in distinct location within that council, essentially putting the spotlight on the Jesuit general after having already welcomed Lainez into the council as though he were Elvis or something. It says, and by the way, for those who are following along in their own copy of the book, we're beginning in the first full paragraph on page 109. It says, such a reception as this, by so distinguished a body of prelates as the Council of Trent, was well calculated to incite the pride and the ambition of the Jesuits, especially of Lainez, the Jesuit general, and to create in their minds the belief that if they continued to pursue the cautious but aggressive policy of Ignatius Loyola, they would bring the Pope and all the ecclesiastical authorities of the Church into obedience to them. All right? This is key, that we understand the true purpose of the Jesuit order. and that is to bring the whole church, including the papacy and all of his prelates, the entire hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church, into complete obedience to the Jesuit general. Okay? This is what R.W. Thompson alluded to earlier, that what Ignatius Loyola was doing was raising up a dissolute faction within the Roman Catholic Church that would eventually overthrow the papacy. And this is what their goal was, even at the Council of Trent, to bring all the ecclesiastical authorities of the Church, that includes the Pope, into obedience to them, the Jesuits. And it says, manifestly, the society considered this the ultimate end contemplated by Ignatius Loyola, bringing the entire Church, Pope included, to their knees in front of the Jesuit general. Manifestly, the society considered this the ultimate end contemplated by Ignatius Loyola, and Lainez was sufficiently skilled in the methods of government to understand the necessity of obtaining from the Council of Trent the recognition of the superiority of the Jesuits over the monastic orders. Okay, he had not yet succeeded in accomplishing the admission of the society, that is, the Jesuits, into France, and this he evidently regarded as an important step in that direction. Flattering as was his reception by the council, it was not all he desired. He considered an additional step necessary to obtain from the council a full approval of the reasons assigned by Ignatius Loyola to justify the establishment of his society. Accordingly, after the council had passed upon the question of faith and morals, it proceeded to investigate the causes of the evils which afflicted the Church. Initially, at the beginning, the council focused all its efforts on restating the doctrines and the dogmas of the Roman Catholic Church. No reform was ever to be conceded to at the Council of Trent with regard to faith and dogma. Now that is what the Protestant Reformation said needed reform. There was something diabolical about the faith and the dogma of the Roman Catholic Church. That's why they called it the synagogue of Satan. That's why they called the papacy the Antichrist. Okay, it was reform of the spiritual part of the church that was most important to the reformers. And to them, the degeneracy, the filthy lives, the sinful lives of the Roman Catholic hierarchy was simply a result of their spiritual error. Okay? It says, accordingly, after the council had passed upon the question of faith and dogma, it proceeded to investigate, quote, the causes of the evils which afflicted the church, unquote. This opened an exceedingly broad field of inquiry and resulted, doubtless as Lainez desired, in the conclusion stated by Dorignac, quote, that these causes were principally the ignorance and immorality of a great portion of the clergy and of the monastic orders, unquote, and that, quote, the best remedy for this evil was to prepare Christian generations by a good system of education, unquote. That is to say, that any effort to reform the existing clergy and the ancient orders would be unavailing, but that the remedy lay in educating other and future generations. And this is why the Jesuits have adopted the position as the educators of the world. They're re-educating the world in order to accept the unquestioning authority of the global God of this world. And that is the Pope of their choosing, which now is a Jesuit order, is a member of the Jesuit order, Jorge Bergoglio, Pope Francis I. Now, he as much as indicated that there was no use trying to reform that which was irreformable. The current hierarchy and the monastic orders of the Roman Catholic Church, they were a lost cause. But the Jesuits intended to raise up a new kind of Roman Catholic, one that would unquestionably answer to a higher authority, to a pope, or to the Jesuit general. And that meant the complete re-education. This is why the Roman Catholic Church declares itself as the divine right teacher of all human flesh, and has dedicated that job to the Jesuits. That's why they're called the great educators. All right, he continues, he says, it's easy to see that this conclusion was unavoidable under the doctrine established by the same council, that is the Council of Trent, and affirmed also by the Jesuits, that the clergy who lead virtuous and those who lead vicious lives possess the same power and authority in the church. Okay? That's the synagogue of Satan, isn't it? Okay? Those who live vicious lives and those who have virtuous lives have the same authority in the Roman Catholic Church. Now, this was a great triumph for Lainez and his society, inasmuch as it was a specific approval of the Council of Trent of the grounds upon which Ignatius Loyola had justified the creation of the Jesuit Society. That is, the incompetency of the Church to reform itself without extraneous aid. Okay, again, here's reference that Ignatius Loyola saw the troubles of the Church being caused by the ineptitude, the corruption, the incompetency, the imbecilic nature of the Church and the monastic orders, including the popes, and that the Church could not reform unless it had help from him and his Jesuit society. He says that is the incompetency of the Church to reform itself without extraneous aid, that is, from the Jesuits, apart from the existing clergy and the monastic orders, and the necessity for an educational system like that of the Jesuits to be maintained by authority and discipline for that purpose. So this is the whole purpose of Jesuit education, to dedicate their graduates to the discipline and purpose of the Jesuit order, to make them unthinking cadavers without thought or reason of their own, and to simply acquiesce to a higher authority. Now it says, and thus equipped by so important an endorsement as the Council of Trent, the Jesuits at once assumed to have been constituted with divine approval the exclusive educators of the world, and to be endowed with authority to enter every nation at will, that's every nation at will, including the United States, and so to train and discipline the quote-unquote Christian generations as to bring them down to a common level of obedience to the united authority of church and state. So what is taught in Jesuit institutions, whether they be high schools, colleges, universities, seminaries, everywhere that they've set up their educational curriculum, is to prepare the world, the Christian world, to accept uninquiring obedience to a union of church and state. Okay? To make Americans, let's talk about America, because that's what we're concerned about. To make Americans fit, to make Americans fit for a union of church and state, and to fit them for unthinking, uninquiring obedience to that authority, the ultimate authority, the union of church and state. Now, that's what our schools are set up to do. That's what our seminaries are set up to do. Every Protestant pastor, minister, every preacher who goes through a seminary today is given education that fits them for uninquiring obedience to a united church and state authority. And we could go into the examples of how they are trained And again, I would make reference to futurism, that which exonerates the papacy as Antichrist and causes the Protestant Reformation to be regarded as a virtual crime against the throne of Almighty God. And of course, if the Protestant Reformation is condemned, then all the governments that came out of the Protestant Reformation as a result of the individuality that is acquired through the Protestant education, that too is an error, and that the true form of government is a union of church and state. This is what's coming out of Vatican Council II and the ecumenical movement, and most, and I believe most ecumenical evangelibellies are virtually unaware of the strategy of the teaching that has overwhelmed the Protestants in this country. And the reading of this book is instructive for God's people today to understand the deception of Vatican Council II and ecumenism, and also the error of dispensational futurism. The Jesuits would be unable to unite church and state. The Jesuits would be unable to promote Vatican Council II and ecumenism if there was a return to true biblical Protestantism. And now that American Christians are deceived, a union of church and state is inevitable. And that's what we're seeing right before our very eyes. The government become dictatorial in nature, not responding to the people. The people are to be governed, not to govern. It's slowly but surely morphing back into the image of the old world order. The new world order is simply a recreated image, mirror image of the old world order. Now, continuing where we left off Friday, it says, without the endorsement obtained by the Jesuits from the Council of Trent, they might have been kept out of Paris entirely, or, at all events, their entry into that city would have been greatly delayed. As it was, the antipathy against them remained so great and universal among the Gallican Christians. Remember, the Gallicans were the ones that they were Catholics. They were French Catholics. They accepted the spiritual power of the Pope and his right to rule over the church, but they wanted him to have no power whatsoever in the government. Okay, to the Jesuits and to the papacy, they are as heretical as were the French Calvinists, the French Protestants, who, by the way, had united with the Gallican Catholics in their attempt to keep the Jesuits out of France. Now, as it was, the antipathy against them remained so great and universal among the Gallican Christians that their admission at last was obtained only upon the condition that they should take a solemn oath to do nothing to impair the liberties of the Gallican Church. And those liberties were separation of church and state, that they would submit to the laws of the nation, that is, that the Jesuits would submit to the civil law, which was separate from the church. You can about imagine how this went over with Lainez, which recognized the Pope as the head of the church, but denied to him the power to excommunicate the king, or to lay an interdict upon the kingdom, or to exercise any jurisdiction over temporal matters, or to dismiss bishops from their office, or to exercise any authority by a legate, unless empowered by the king, and that they would, moreover, maintain those provisions of law which assign to a general council of the church power superior to that of a pope. In other words, that papal infallibility was not a part of the Christian faith, according to the Gallicans. They did not believe in papal infallibility. They would they would acquiesce to the decision of a council together with the Pope, but they would not allow the Pope to rule as a king. They stripped him of his temporal power and separated the government so that the government answered to the people and not to the Pope. Now, as I said before, all of these stipulations that the Gallican Catholics placed upon the Jesuits as a condition of their entry into France was, well, you can about imagine from Lainez, laughable. Because if any Jesuit would submit to these conditions, he would essentially cease to be a Jesuit. And the author continues, he says, there is abundant reason for believing, in view of both preceding and subsequent events, that when the Jesuits took this oath, and they did take this oath, they had not the least idea of being bound by it. No Jesuit's conscience was ever bound by such an oath. And as I said before, to seriously take that oath with any intention at all, to obey that oath, they would cease to be Jesuits. Now, the authority of Lainez, the Jesuit general, under the circumstances related, became potential enough to enable him to influence the decisions of the Queen Mother, that's Catherine de' Medici, and the court of France. And finding himself thus sustained, it was not long before the Jesuit policy began to bear its legitimate fruits. Of course, his most heavily charged batteries were immediately opened upon the Protestants, to whose heresies he traced all the existing evils of the time. Okay? As soon as the Jesuits walk in, the first thing they do is begin to persecute the Protestants. You'd think Washington, D.C. is crawling with Jesuits, that they don't direct all of their efforts against Protestantism in this country? That's precisely what they were organized to do, to destroy Protestantism. We're looking at the example of history regarding France, and this is instructive for American Bible-believing Christians and Protestants. Now it says an occasion for this soon occurred. The Protestants petitioned, remember this is during the period of the growth of the Protestant Reformation, which had found some refuge and peace in France among the Gallican Catholics, and they began to petition openly for authorized places of worship in France, a Roman Catholic country. It says the Protestants petitioned for, quote, places of worship, unquote, that is, merely to be allowed to worship at designated places according to their consciences. Now, all they're looking for is freedom to erect churches in France, where they can worship openly instead of clandestinely in underground fashion. And I see we've come up on the break. You're listening to Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. We'll return and continue our reading of the book Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
In this day of economic uncertainty and soaring unemployment, safe investments are often hard to find, but investing in the precious metals is the safest investment of all, because gold and silver is real money. Government-printed currency is not. Call Melody Cedarstrom at Discount Gold and Silver Trading Company at 1-800-375-4188. Melody has been helping people secure their financial future for over 10 years. While others in the business claim honesty, Melody will deliver. Give her a call, 1-800-375-4188. That's 800-375-4188.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. Remember, Inquisition Update is listener supported. So if you like Inquisition Update, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program. Now, the Protestants of France petitioned the government for places of worship. That is, merely to be allowed to worship at designated places according to their consciences. Lainez fully understood the meaning of this, and the end it would ultimately accomplish if the Protestant petition were allowed. His keen sagacity enabled him to know that if the differences between Protestantism and the papacy became the object of intellectual discussion, free intellectual discussion, upon a forum where human reason had the right to assert itself, the triumph of the former, that is, the triumph of Protestantism over Roman Catholicism, would be assured. Therefore, true to his own instincts and the teachings of his society, he remonstrated with Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Mother, against granting the prayer of the Protestants, and in his memorial upon the subject said, quote, he pointed out to her so forcibly the danger to the church and the state that such a concession would entail, that appreciating his argument, she refused to sanction the erection of Protestant places of worship, unquote. So to Ignatius Loyola, the open discussion of Protestantism would would end in a victory of Protestantism over the monarchical system, the papacy, and the royalty, the crown of France. And that monarchy would be overruled, and that a republic would take its place, and the papacy would be shut out, and so would the crown. So Catherine de' Medici, in a means of saving her own occupation as Queen Mother of France, simply denied that places of worship should be built in France for Protestant worship. This is religious persecution, and this shows the strategy that the Jesuits have used historically to preserve the papacy and the monarchical system, to oppose Protestantism. The main object of the Jesuit order is to destroy Protestantism. Now it says, these facts, related upon Jesuit authority and boasted by their historians, furnish the most palpable and incontestable proof of the conspiracy of Catherine de' Medici and the Jesuits after the latter obtained admission into France, to suppress the freedom of religious worship and to mold the policy of church and state as to render its existence impossible. It was an odious and revolting conspiracy, but the objects to be accomplished justified in the eyes of the Queen, of Lainez, and all of his followers. It was the cardinal point of the professed Jesuit policy, the most prominent feature of their organization. No imagination is fertile enough to picture the condition into which the civilized world would have been plunged if this conspiracy, besides its temporary and bloody triumph in France, had become sufficiently powerful to dictate the governments of the modern states. What R.W. Thompson is describing here is the New World Order. Think of this as the New World Order. The accomplishment of the subjection of all the governments of the world to Jesuit authority would stifle even the most fertile imagination. He says no imagination is fertile enough to picture the condition into which the civilized world would have been plunged if this conspiracy between Catherine de' Medici and the Jesuit order were an example followed all over the world. No imagination is fertile enough to picture the condition into which the civilized world would have been plunged if this conspiracy, besides its temporary and bloody triumph in France, had become sufficiently powerful to dictate the governments of modern states. He's simply referring to the New World Order. This example that we're now reading about, the union of church and state in France, is the example that is being repeated all over the world in the creation of the Vatican Jesuit-led New World Order. And he is absolutely correct when he says no imagination is fertile enough to picture the condition into which the civilized world is now being plunged. This is why I say R.W. Thompson is probably one of the most prophetic secular writers I've ever read. He perfectly has a handle on the Vatican Jesuit-led New World Order. Seeing it way off in the distance, he's warning the whole world, not just Americans, but the whole world, what will happen if the Jesuits are not destroyed. Now, he says the Gallican Christians had for centuries successfully resisted all attempts of the papacy to interfere with the temporal affairs of France. And whilst they disagreed with Protestants upon questions of religious faith, the two forces were united in opposition to the Jesuits because of the direct hostility of the latter to both. Each could see that the entrance of the Society of the Jesuits into France under the control and dominion of an alien power would be the introduction of a disturbing and hostile element, which would put an end to the concord and the harmony then rapidly springing up between the two Christian bodies. And this folks, I'm going to add another dimension to this. Right now we're talking about the Jesuits and their opposition to the Gallican Catholics who refuse the temporal power of the Pope, and the Protestants who refuse both the spiritual and the temporal power of the Pope, and seek to destroy both, to bring both into submission to the papacy, to unite church and state, and to make them all subservient equally to Antichrist. But what position is God taking in all of this? We're going to get into this aspect of the question even further when we begin our discussion about Germany, which is coming up next. But I don't believe God wants peace and unity between His people and Antichrist. God forbid the Jews to have any alliance or any treaty or any contract or any concord with the pagan nations surrounding them. And I don't believe God's will has changed for His people. We are to be a peculiar people, set apart, sanctified for His service. We worship Him and Him alone. He's the only authority in our lives. But here we have Protestants who are found a common cause with the Gallican Catholics. And you might imagine that if allowed, this concord would have grown. Religious toleration would have grown. Is that what God wants? I pose the question to my listeners so that they might contemplate these things for themselves. But I assert, my personal belief is that we are to have nothing to do with the Church of Antichrist. We are not to have peace and unity with Antichrist. We are to stand steadfast in the faith of Jesus Christ and resist Antichrist. Now, I believe God's hand is in this. Even as we are reading here in the controversy of France with the Jesuits, God does not want any union between His people and the Roman Catholic Church any more than the Jesuits want unity of the Catholics, the Gallican Catholics, with Protestants. Now, he continues, he says, this the Jesuits intend to prevent by whatsoever means they can manage to employ. For from the beginning of their existence they have opposed everything that they could not subjugate. Therefore they realized the importance of having the monarchical power upon their side, especially when they saw it wielded by such a queen as Catherine de Medici, so that by conspiracy with it against the Gallican Christians and the Protestants, they could destroy the liberties of the former and entirely suppress the spirit of free inquiry asserted by the latter. Keeping these objects always before them, the Jesuits considered them of sufficient magnitude to justify any form of intrigue, and they were sufficiently familiar with the qualities of the Queen, Catherine de Medici, to know that she possessed such love of power and capacity for conspiracy that they could successfully play upon her ambition and prejudices to accomplish their purposes. There's no intelligent reader of French history who is not familiar with the steps taken by this perfidious queen regent after the admission of the Jesuits into France to bring about the terrible massacre of St. Bartholomew, an event so closely allied with others of which they were the undoubted authors that one must close his eyes not to see the evidence which points to their agency in that infamous transaction. They needed such bloody work to give them the mastery over France. And although they have since then been more than once expelled in disgrace from French soil, they have returned again and again to torment her people, who still continue to realize under their republic how increasingly they labor for the entire overthrow of every form of popular government. The Jesuits, together with Catherine de Medici, set the stage for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre when 70,000 French Huguenot Protestants were butchered. 70,000 in Paris alone. And and the crusade against the Protestants of France spread all over the country. That's what happens when the Jesuits get together with the government. They foment religious hostility and then open persecution of Protestants. And that is exactly what's going to happen in this country. History is going to repeat itself just as sure as the sun's going to come up in the east in the morning. And the Jesuits won't be stopped. They were cast out of France numerous times for the same types of intrigue. Both Catholics and Protestants together reviled the Jesuits and cast them repeatedly out of France. And this common hatred for the Jesuit order and their political intrigue is what finally inspired Pope Clement XIV to suppress that order. But they always come back, and they always incite discord in governments where the people rule, governments that sprang out of the Protestant Reformation. That's their way to defeat the Protestant Reformation, to replace popular government with a union of church and state, make Roman Catholicism the official religion of the state, and then begin state-sponsored religious persecution against Protestants. This old song has been played so many times in history that it's impossible that the American people could be so ignorant about it, except for the fact that the Jesuits, the great educators, who had the most prestigious educating authority in this country, that even control the public school system, the seminaries, have stripped this history from our knowledge and blinded us to the intrigue of the Jesuit order, the Counter-Reformation. They have blinded us to the Counter-Reformation. And it's time to get the Jesuits out of education. It's time to get the Jesuits out of this country. It's time to get the Jesuits out of the world. The New World Order can only come about if the Jesuits are allowed to continue their intrigue in this country and every government in the world. Now we're going to move on. We've been through Spain, Portugal, and France, and now we're going to Germany. And this chapter has the utmost importance for Americans, because Germany, for all practical purposes, was just like America, especially where Catholics and Protestants living together is concerned. It's particularly important for the listeners to pay particular attention to this chapter and see for themselves how the Jesuits sowed discord among Catholics, German Catholics and German Protestants living together in peace, and then overturned the government and then persecuted Protestants. The example that the Jesuits set in Germany is a model for what they intend to do here in the United States of America. This is chapter 7. It's entitled, The Society Enters Germany. The Jesuits encountered less difficulty in establishing themselves in Germany than in either Spain, Portugal, or France. Race differences may have occasioned this. The populations resting upon the shores of the Mediterranean and Atlantic descended from the early Celts and became readily Latinized. They accepted the traditionary religion of Rome, knew comparatively little of the Bible, which was a sealed book to them, and received their Christian faith only from the Roman Catholic clergy. There was no word in any of their languages which signified liberty in the sense of a right derived from nature and law. With them, liberty conveyed the idea of a franchise granted by authority and subject to be withdrawn at pleasure. Hence, they yielded implicit obedience to Rome and accepted it as consistent with the divine will that no other than the Romish religion should be recognized or tolerated, and that force might be justifiably employed to suppress all others when it was deemed necessary to do so. Consequently, they were inclined at first to resist, or at least to look suspiciously upon the Jesuits, inasmuch as Ignatius Loyola had declared it to be the controlling reason for the creation of his society that the ancient monastic orders and the clergy had by their vices endangered the church. This seemed heretical, and therefore they practiced towards him and his followers at first their accustomed intolerance. Now, this is typical of most of the countries at this time. They were initially suspicious of the Jesuit order because they inferred that the papacy and the monastic orders were corrupt and caused the downfall of the Roman Catholic Church. And this seemed to put in question the authority of the church altogether. And these people were accustomed not to tolerate any criticism of the church, and especially not of the Pope. So this is why initially the Jesuits were under so much suspicion. Now it says they preferred the old system to which they had become accustomed to anything new with regard either to the church or the faith. Accordingly, we find that among the Latin populations, the influence of the Pope became necessary to the admission and establishment of the Jesuit society. They yielded only to his authority because they regarded disobedience of him as heresy. It was otherwise with the Germans. Okay, this is what makes the Germans different. It's the same thing that makes Americans different. As the descendants of the old Teutons, they had some conceptions of natural liberty and had indicated a desire for popular government by the election of their kings. So these Teutons, as we covered in R.W. Thompson's previous book, The Papacy and the Civil Power, they understood the concept of individual liberty. They understood some of the concepts of the Republican government because they elected their kings. And it says the scriptures had been placed in their hands as early as the 4th century when Bishop Ulfilas translated the Gospels and part of the Old Testament into the Gothic language, thereby making them accessible to the people and stimulating the desire to read and understand them. This created a sense of individuality, which soon became more diffused than elsewhere in Europe, thus making the Germans an intelligent and tolerant race. That's what happens when the Scripture is given to the people. They have a personal relationship with Christ. They have individuality. They love freedom and self-government. Okay? Now it says their tolerance, therefore, when the Jesuits appeared, prevented any popular commotion. By that time, the influences of the Protestant Reformation had become greatly extended and had impressed the minds of a large number of the German people. Protestantism had become established, and the population was divided into two religious parties, Catholic and Protestant. Okay? This is what we have in common with the German people. Catholics and Protestants living in peace together. But these parties, influenced towards each other by the old Teutonic liberality and tolerance, lived together in perfect peace and harmony, each maintaining its own religious faith and worship without interference by the other. There were also divisions among the Protestants, some being the followers of Luther and others of Calvin. But there was no religious strife between Catholics and Protestants. According to the German custom of that period, there were earnest disputations about doctrine, but no tumult, nothing to disturb the quiet of society. Persecution on account of religious differences was entirely unknown. A persecutor would have been considered a public enemy. The true spirit of Christianity prevailed, the natural consequence of the same form of religious liberty provided for by the institutions of the United States and which might now exist throughout the Christian world, but for the baneful influences of the Jesuits. R.W. Thompson infers that if it were not for the Jesuits, there would be peace between Protestants and Catholics living side by side, different in their faith, but no persecution. And this would exist all around the world. The free, open discussion of religion. Each man worshiping God according to the dictates of their own conscience, and the leading and teaching of the Holy Spirit, and the Scriptures. And do you know what this would bode for Catholicism? The truth always wins out if the truth is allowed freedom to speak. That's the peace that we should have with Catholics. Free and open discussion. But that's not what the Jesuits want, because they always lose in a free and open discussion. Monarchism is always detested. The oppression and tyranny of the papacy and the monarchical system that supported it, you know, the woman and the beast recorded in Revelation chapter 17, people would always choose liberty in Christ. And that's why the Jesuits always have to step in. And that's why there is no peace, when peace is the byword today. Now, the Venetian ambassador, then in Germany, thus describes the peaceful condition of the German Christians. We're talking about Catholics and Protestants. Quote, one party has accustomed itself to put up with the other so well that in any place where there happens to be a mixed population, Catholic and Protestant, little or no notice is taken as to whether the person is Catholic or Protestant. Not only villages, but even families are in this manner mixed up together, and there even exists houses where children belong to one persuasion while the parents belong to the other, and where brothers adhere to opposite creeds. Catholics and Protestants indeed intermarry with each other, and no one takes any notice of the circumstance or offers any opposition thereto. Unquote. The German author to whom we are indebted for the above extract says in addition, quote, even many princes of the Catholic Church in Germany went even a step further and appointed men who were thorough Protestants to situations or positions in their court as counselors, judges, magistrates, or whatever other office it might be, without any opposition or objection being affected thereto, unquote. And these, he adds in a note, were not at all exceptional cases. So for all intents and purposes, Germany was just like the United States.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.